But it also means that you have to think. Not hard, but just a little bit. We're going to crunch a few numbers. And sometimes when we start crunching numbers, people automatically say, well, I wasn't good at math, so I just kind of zoned out. Well, what's good about these numbers is I walk you all the way through them. All right? So you don't have to think that much, but you do have to think just a little bit. So tonight as we go a little bit deeper, just remember you asked for it. All right? It's kind of interesting. I think we're on our 21st week, and we were hoping to get through the book of Genesis in 12 weeks, and we haven't even made it through the third event. But the good thing about it is, by the time we finish, which will probably take about a year, you will probably know more than 90% of pastors about the book of Genesis. That's not meant to be prideful. It just simply means that we do dig a little bit deeper, and the majority of churches choose not to do that. But we have a different philosophy about Wednesday nights. I kind of feel like Wednesday nights is not supposed to be church. It's supposed to be more like Bible college. And so you kind of get a taste of what I went through when I was getting my degree in biblical literature and New Testament Greek. Now, not New Testament Greek, even though I'm going to bring that out and use it, but in biblical literature. You know, it's kind of interesting, but we would go through the genealogies, the kind of things that most people just kind of zone out, but you'll understand why the genealogies are so important tonight. In fact, I had the privilege of reading this really interesting book, and you notice I'm saying it with a straight face, the Genesis genealogies. But it is interesting to me. Probably wouldn't be interesting to you, but I'm going to condense a lot of things, and hopefully things are going to make sense. So, having said that, last week we finished chapter 6, and my goal this week was to finish chapter 7, but I realized very quickly that that's not going to be the case. We'll be lucky to get to verse number 6, and that's okay. But we will get started in chapter 7, but before we start, let's talk about the date of the flood. In what year did the flood take place? Does anyone know? How many of you were thinking that there was even no way to calculate that? How in the world would we know when the flood took place? I guess that means every one of you knew that you could calculate it, right? Did everyone know that you could calculate and know exactly when the flood took place? Well, you can. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some of the genealogies in chapter 5 to see if we can figure out the date of the flood. Because God doesn't put useless information in the Bible. I don't know why, but sometimes we think that He does that. Remember, the golden nuggets are in the details. But we have the tendency to gloss over the details, and because we like to be elaborate speakers or orators, we throw things in to make it sound good, and so we automatically think that God does the very same thing. But God does not do that. If there's specific words there or details, there are nuggets, golden nuggets in those details, so we want to dig there. Well, he takes a whole chapter, Genesis chapter 5, and he starts giving the genealogy of Adam. And the majority of us, we just skip over that. We go from Genesis chapter 4, we look at the first few verses in Genesis chapter 5, and we say, oh, we're moving on to chapter 6. Well, I did that too, knowing that when we got to chapter 7, we were to come back to it. So, we're going to take a look at the genealogies in chapter 5 so we can calculate when the flood took place. So let's start with Adam in verses 1 through 5 of Genesis chapter 5. It says, this is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day that God created man, in the likeness of God made He him. Now I want you to notice that word day. The word day is the Hebrew word yom, and it refers to a 24-hour period. So, time is going to be calculated from the day that Adam was created. That is going to be 0. Does that make sense? He's now going to go into the genealogies of Adam, but he starts off with, in the day that God made man. And the word day is the Hebrew word yom. It refers to a specific 24-hour period. So that tells us that time is going to be calculated from the day that Adam was created. Pick it up in verse 2. Male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their name, not his name, their name, Adam, man, in the day when they were created. And Adam lived 130 years and begat a son in his own likeness. 130 years from when? 130 years from the day that man was created. Again, that word day is yom. So we're going to use that as the starting point to calculate. If we're going to say he was 130 years old when he begat the son Seth, we got to know, when did he start calculating? He started calculating from the day that he was created. Verse 4. And the days of Adam after he had begotten Seth were 800 years, and he begat sons and daughters. And all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. Now, the way this is stated becomes a pattern in Genesis chapter 5. First, we're told how old Adam was when his son Seth was born. And then we're told how long he lived after Seth was born. Now, we can calculate those two things to find out how old he was when he dies, but we don't have to do that, because he finally tells us how old he was when he died. But the reason he does it that way is so we can know that there is no mistake. Adam was 130 years old when Seth was born. He lived 800 years after that. We add 800 and 130, we get 930. But he doesn't let us do the math ourselves. He says, and Adam was 930 when he died. So now we're seeing specific numbers given in such a way that a mistake cannot be made. And this is a pattern that's followed in Genesis chapter 5, in Adam's genealogy. Let me give you one more example, because I don't want to go through all of them, because all of them follow this same pattern. But let me give you one more example so you can see the pattern. Look at verses 6 through 8. And Seth lived 105 years and begat Enoch. Now that's how you pronounce it if you have the King James Version. But actually that's not a good translation from the Hebrew. It really is Enoch. And if you have the NIV or the New American Standard, it says Enoch. So even though I'm using the King James Version up here, I'm going to pronounce it Enoch. So Seth lived 105 years and begat Enoch. And Seth lived after he begat Enoch 807 years. And he had other sons and daughters. And all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. Now, we could have added those two numbers up, and we could have came to that conclusion, but God wants to make sure that we understand. There is no mistake here. He's giving us exact numbers. So, we see the pattern here. Seth was 105 when he had a son. Seth lived 807 years after Enoch was born, and he finally died when he was 912 years old. Those three facts are given for each one. Does everyone see the pattern? Go back and read Genesis chapter 5. It's not just for those two. It's for everyone that's listed in Adam's genealogy. The first thing that's given is how old they were when their son was born. The second thing that's given is how long they lived after their son was born. And finally, he doesn't allow you to calculate it because God knows some of you might be bad at math. So he adds it up for you and says, finally, this is how old they were when they died. That is the pattern. And it's consistent all the way to Noah. So everyone that's listed in this genealogy, in Adam's genealogy to Noah, follows this very pattern. Now, this is very important, because this allows us to calculate the exact date of the flood. How many of you didn't know that? You just thought it happened. Yeah. See, we just skipped Genesis chapter 5, and we went all the way from Genesis 4 to Genesis chapter 6, and we thought, well, sometime it happened back there. But we miss out so much, not realizing that if we take a little time with the genealogies, we can actually calculate not just the date of the flood. We can calculate the exact date of the flood. Wow. People, we know when the flood occurred. But before we calculate when the flood occurred, let me explain something. Adam had a lot of sons besides Seth. And he probably had a lot of children, including sons, before Seth was born. So why does he forget about all of those? And he says, and Adam was 130 years before Seth, or when Seth was born. Why doesn't he mention all of those other sons? Because there's that little passing, and he had many sons and daughters. We see that through there. Why doesn't he mention that? It's because we're only interested in tracing Adam's genealogy to Noah. So we don't care about the other children. In other words, we don't care about the other branches in the family tree. If I want to look and go all the way back to my great-great-great-grandpa, I'm going to go all the way back there, and I'm only interested in the son that's a direct descendant, or I'm a direct descendant from. He might have had several children, but this son produced this son, who produced this son, who produced George Nolan, who produced me. And it really doesn't matter that George Nolan had Riddell, Doug, Steve, or Carol. We're just interested in me. Does that make sense? Now, in this story with the flood, one man and his family is going to be saved. Who is that one man? Noah. We don't care about all the other kids. They're going to be destroyed in the flood. So when we trace Adam's genealogy, we're going to trace Adam's genealogy to Noah, and we don't care about any of the other branches. And that's why the other sins aren't listed. So keep in mind, as we're going through this, we're only interested in tracing Adam's genealogy to Noah. So only the sons that are in the direct lineage from Adam to Noah are listed. Does everyone understand that? Because if you don't, you're thinking, wow, there had to be all of these people, and yet we're just getting this. Why? Because it's all we're interested in. When we look at the genealogies of Jesus, we want to trace him back to David. And from David to Abraham. And from Abraham to Adam. There are so many branches. We don't care about those branches because we're only interested in Jesus. And we're interested in David. So from Jesus to David, David to Abraham, Abraham to Adam. We're only looking at that. And you need to understand that. Does that make sense? Good. So let's look at a chart that's going to help us calculate when the flood occurred. So you must think a little bit, not much, because I explain everything to you. All right? Very simple to see. We're going to start with Adam. And we're going to calculate it from the day that Adam was created. So on the day that Adam was created is 0. Everyone with me? So Adam was 130 years old when he had Seth. And he lived to 930. So he died at the age of 930. Now this is really interesting because he's going to have a lot of great grandkids that he gets to see and fellowship with and know. But he's 130 years old when Seth is born. Now we come to Seth. Seth was 105, the scripture tells us, when Enoch was born. Now, Adam was 130 years when Enoch was born. But Seth was 105 when Enoch was born. He lived 800 years, and when I say he actually lived 912, but he was 800 years old when Adam died. So, he got to know his dad for 800 years. That's what that number is right there. Seth was 800 years old when Adam died. Now, we're also told that Enoch was 90 years old when Kenan was born. But when Kenan was born, Adam was 235 years old. Does that make sense? Enoch was 695 when Adam died. But he lived to be 905. Wow. Are we catching this? All of these genealogies are listed given with the specific numbers, so we're not pulling this out of the hat. We're pulling this out of Genesis chapter 5. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to go through just so you can explain the chart all the way to Noah, because we're going to draw some conclusions on that, all right? So, Kenan was 70 years old. See that 70? When he had Mahalalel. And that's how you pronounce it, believe it or not. Mahalalel. And Adam was 325 years old when Mahalalel was born. Kenan was 605 when Adam died, but he lived to be 910. Mahalalel was 65 years old when he had Jared, but Adam was 395. Mahalalel was 535 years old when Adam died, but he lived to be 895. Jared, nope, I didn't skip any. Jared was 162 years old when he had Enoch. Adam was 460 when Jared had Enoch. And Jared was 470 years old when Adam died at 930. But he lived to be 962. These are the years when he lived to be 962, the date he died. Each one of these dates. But let's keep going. Enoch, I don't want to say only lived to be 365. Why do I not want to say that? Because the Bible says that Enoch walked with God and he was no more. In other words, Enoch was raptured. He went to be with God supernaturally. And so after Enoch, though, had a child before he was raptured. He was 65 years old when he had, anyone ever heard of this guy? Methuselah. And Adam was 687 years old when Enoch had Methuselah. Methuselah was 243 years old when Adam died, but he lived all the way to the age of 969, and he died in the year 1656, calculated from the day that Adam was created. That's the year that he died. All of this is coming from Genesis chapter 5, not making any of this up. Go back and read Genesis chapter 5. Okay. Now Methuselah was 187 years old when he had Lamech, when Lamech was born. Adam was 687 years old when Methuselah had Lamech. Methuselah was 243 years old when Adam died. He lived to be 969. He died in the year 1656. Now, Lamech was 56 years old when he had Noah. Does that make sense? Now, what's interesting is Noah was not born until, I said 56. Lamech was 182 years old when he had Noah, and what takes place is Lamech was 56 when Adam died. So Noah was born after Adam died. Now, let's calculate this, all right? That would make Adam his great, 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 great grandpa. But he only dies one generation from Noah. Does that make sense? So, when was Noah born? That's very important. When was Noah born? He was born in the year 1056 AAC. What is AAC? After Adam was created. So he was born. See this number? 1056. This is the year that Noah was born. So when did the flood occur? It occurred 1,656 years after Adam was created. But I told you we could know the exact date. On the 17th day of the second month in 1656 AAC. AAC stands for after Adam was created. Turn to Genesis chapter 7, verse number 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, when was Noah born? 1056. How do we know that he was born then? Adam was 874 years old at this time when Lamech was born. Lamech was 182 when Noah was born. So we add 874 to 182. What do you get when you add those two numbers? 2 and 4 is 6. 8 and 7 is 15. Add that to 1 and 8, and you get 1,056. It's not rocket science. That's the whole purpose of Genesis chapter 5, following this pattern, because God wants to make sure that even if you're not a math genius, we're going to give you the answers. So, Adam was 874 years old when Lamech was born. Lamech was 182 when Noah was born, so we add Adam's age at this point that Lamech was born to the age he was when he had Noah, and we know that Noah was born in 1056. That was the whole purpose of the genealogies in Genesis chapter 5, was for you to be able to calculate exactly when the flood took place. So now turn to Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. Let's read this through. In the 600th year of Noah's life, when was he born? 1056. So we add 600 years to that, and what do you get? 1656. So in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the flood began. So what day did the flood occur? The second month, the 17th day in the year, 1656. Wow. Now, how many of you goes, I would have never done that? Yeah, sometimes being a pastor is not that interesting. I literally have a book on chronology, lots of books on genealogies that you go through to figure out when Abraham was born, all of these different things. But to truly understand certain things, you have to do that. You've got to dig deeper. And it's really not that difficult, because let me tell you what God does. He calls us sheep. And sheep are not too smart. Sheep are really dumb creatures. If it's raining and they hold their head up, they're drowned. And they won't put their head down, and you got to get doing that. They're stupid creatures. But he calls us sheep. So when God wants us to understand something, he makes it simple. So we get in Genesis chapter 5, and he starts this pattern. It's like, okay, Adam was 130 years old when he had Seth, and he lived for X amount of years, and he was 930 when he died. And Seth was X amount of years when he had his first child, and he lived X amount of years after that, and when he died, he was this old. Why does it do all that? Because God's wanting you to calculate and know by the time we get to the 7th chapter, verse number 11, he can tell us exact day when the flood occurred. People, the Bible is very specific as to when the flood occurred. Why? Just so we can know? Just so you can razzle-dazzle your coworkers tomorrow? So you can walk in and you can say, I've been studying my Bible. Do you know what year the flood occurred and the day? You don't? If you studied like I did. You know, I was going through the genealogies in Genesis chapter 5, and, kind of calculating this, and you go through all this, and you say, you know what? The flood occurred in the year 1656 on the second month of the 17th day. Yep, see? Now, why would God do this? Not to razzle-dazzle our friends, make us look smart. He's got a specific purpose. And we're going to understand why God is so specific when we get to verse number 6 of chapter 10, and also verse number 10 of chapter 10, of chapter 7, and verse number 10 of chapter 7. There's a purpose for this. So, now that we know when the flood occurred, let's look at chapter 7. Let's move there. Turn to verses 1 through 3. And the Lord said unto Noah, Come thou and all thy house into the ark, for thee have I seen righteous before me in this generation. Of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by sevens, the male and his female, and of beasts that are not clean by two, the male and his female. Of fowls also of the air by sevens, the male and the female, to keep seed alive upon the face of the earth. Now I want you to notice in verse number 1 that God didn't say, go into the ark. No. He said, come into the ark, which implies that God was in the ark. If you're in the house, do you look at your kids and you want them to come in and say, go into the house? No, what do you say? Come into the house. Now, if you're outside with the kids and you want them to go in the house, what do you say? Go into the house. Did you notice that he didn't say, go into the ark? He said, come into the ark. Now, why did he say come into the ark? He said come into the ark because God was in the ark. And even though the flood would soon devastate the earth and all those on the earth, they were going to be safe with God because God was in the ark with them. And that's a very important point. I told you that this ark was not considered to be a ship. It had no steering mechanism. Noah was not the captain. Basically, all this was a container that would preserve them when the floodwaters came up and they went in any and every direction. But wouldn't that be dangerous? Because we know how powerful floods are. Floods can sweep things away and it pushes you into other things. And as it's beginning to take place and there's mountains, wouldn't it come in and crash it up against a mountain and break the ark in two? We saw what happened to the Titanic when it ran into a great iceberg. Couldn't that happen as the floodwaters were coming and it was sweeping things, and all of a sudden the waters haven't covered everything yet because it's rising? Don't you think Noah said when God was telling him to build this ark, well, God, this is great on these detailed instructions, but I noticed that there's no way to steer this ship. If there's going to be a flood, it's going to be powerful, and it's going to sweep things, and what if we run into something? And God says, don't worry about it, Noah. I'm in the ark. I'm the captain. You're not the captain. So when it comes time, he says, Noah, come into the ark. Now, in verse number 2, Noah is given a final and more detailed set of instructions. He's told to take aboard the ark 7 pairs of all the clean animals and 1 pair of each of the unclean animals. Now, contrary to what some liberal theologians say, this isn't a contradiction to what Noah was told in Genesis chapter 6, verses 19 and 20. If you remember, in Genesis chapter 6, verses 19 and 20, he told Noah to do what? To bring in 2 of each animal. Now we get to chapter 7, he says, I'm changing my mind. I want you to bring in 7 pairs of the clean animals and only 1 pair of all the unclean animals. So liberal theologians look at this and say, here's a contradiction. He's changing the rules. But that's not true. Turn back to Genesis chapter 6, verses 19 and 20. This is a problem when people don't dig a little bit deeper. It says in Genesis 6, 19, 20, and of every living things of all flesh, 2 of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark, to keep them alive with thee. They shall be male and female, of fowls after their kind, and of cattle after their kind, of every creeping thing of the earth after his kind. 2 of every sort shall come unto thee to keep them alive. Wow, and it says specifically 2. Underline that word 2. 2 is translated from the Hebrew word shenayim, and it means 2, or if it's referring to a set, it always means pair. Now, a male and a female is a set. 2 males would not be a set. 2 females would not be a set. So he tells them to bring in shenayim, a set. You do not translate it as 2. In Hebrew, you translate it as pairs. So in this context, it's definitely referring to a pair, a male and a female. So Genesis chapter 6, verses 19 and 20 is simply a general statement. Noah's supposed to bring animals aboard the ark in pairs, a male and a female of each species. And that's all verses 19 and 20 in chapter 6 is saying. It's not specific. He's basically telling Noah. We started off with Adam. He specifically tells Noah, we need a male and a female. We need pairs. So what we're going to do is we're going to substitute the word pairs for the word two in verses 19 and 20, and you'll get the gist of what God was telling Noah, because it should have been translated this way anyway. Whenever this Hebrew word is used for a set, it means pairs, not two. So let's substitute the word pairs for the word two. And of every living thing of all flesh, pairs of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark to keep them alive with thee. They shall be male and female. Do you see what he's saying? It's got to be a male and a female. It's a set. They're pairs. Of fowls after their kind, and of cattle after their kind. Of every creeping thing of the earth after his kind, pairs of every sort shall come unto thee to keep them alive. So he's just making a general statement in chapter 6, verses 19 and 20, and just is explaining to Noah, these animals are going to come to you, and you know what you're going to notice? They're all pairs. I won't send two males, I won't send two females. I'm going to send a male and a female. They're pairs. These pairs will come on the ark. Don't stop them from coming on the ark. They're here for a purpose. They're going to repopulate the earth. Now, in Genesis chapter 7, verse 2, God's going to get more specific now. Have you ever noticed that about God? When God's directing our life, He gives us general directions in the beginning. You know, when God called me in the ministry, He said, Alan, I'm calling you into the ministry. What exactly do you want me to do, God? Do you want me to preach? Do you want me to be an associate pastor? Do you want me to be a youth pastor? What do you want me to do? So I started as an associate pastor. I'm going to school to learn all of this. I don't know whether I'm going to be a youth pastor, associate pastor, senior pastor, what? God gives general direction. But the closer you get to the objective, you know what God begins to do? He begins to give you specific directions. So in the very beginning, in Genesis chapter 6, verses 19 and 20, He's given Noah general direction. I'm going to send pairs of animals to you, males and females. Oh yeah, that would make sense, God. You're going to kill everything. We're going to have to repopulate this earth. Then He gets close. Genesis chapter 7. This is the story. We're here now. God's getting ready to send the flood. So now He gets specific. Now you're going to notice, Noah, that of all the clean animals, because you're not going on a safari to get them, they're coming to you. You're going to notice that there's going to be 7 pairs of clean animals, but only 1 pair of unclean animals. Wow. Why 7? Why would you have 7? And how does Noah know which animals are clean and which animals are unclean? Because the Mosaic law is not going to come till way on down the line. So how in the world does Noah know what's considered clean and what's considered unclean? Well, let's look back at this chart. I told you, I like this chart. If you look back at this chart, you know what you're going to notice? You're going to notice that Noah knew all but 3 of the 10 generation of patriarchs before the flood. He lived with them. The only 3 that he didn't know was Adam, Seth, and Enoch. Because Enoch was raptured. Adam, see, these were the only 3 that weren't around when Noah was alive. Adam died 126 years before Noah was born. How do we know that? Well, we know because we calculated it, that he was born in the year 1056, but he died at 930. We subtract those 2 numbers, and guess what we get? 126 years. So before 126 years before Noah was born, Adam died. Seth died how many years before Noah was born? 14. Here's Seth. He was 130 years, or Adam was 130 years old when Seth was born, Seth was 105, but he lived 800 years, or he was 800 when Adam died at 930. He had that 130 to 800. But he lived 912 years, so it was the year 1042. So if I subtract 1042 from 1056, guess what? Seth died 14 years before Noah was born. And the only reason he didn't know Enoch is because Enoch was raptured. But you know what that tells me? It tells me that Noah lived and knew Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Methuselah, and Lamech. Oh my gosh. He knew people who knew Adam, who spoke directly to him, who passed down all of this information. He knew all the other patriarchs who lived during the time of Adam. So they were able to tell him what animals were acceptable as sacrifices to God and what animals weren't. Now, we're not going to study the story of Cain and Abel. But if we did, we could go back to the story of Cain and Abel and we could say, Abel knew what to offer as a sacrifice to God, and Cain knew too, but he didn't do it. He tried to offer something to God that God said, that's not acceptable. This is the only type of sacrifice or offering that I will accept. And Cain got all huffy about it. But you see, every one of these lived at the time of Adam. Adam only died 126 years before Noah. And then we look at Seth. Seth only died 14 years before Noah. And Seth was, he lived with Adam for 800 years. So all of this is passed down. That's how Noah knows what's clean and what's not. He knew which animals were considered to be clean and which were unclean. You see, the animals that were considered clean were the domesticated animals that were acceptable for sacrifice to God. And God had told Adam which were acceptable as sacrifices. That's how Noah knew. Now, why was Noah supposed to take more of the unclean animals on the ark than the unclean animals? Why was he supposed to take 7 pairs of the clean animals, but only 1 pair of the unclean animals? We're going to find out something about God's character here. 2 reasons. Number 1, because Noah is going to offer 1 pair of each of the clean animals as a sacrifice to God. Turn to Genesis chapter 8, verse number 20. And Noah built an altar. This is after the flood. They come back on dry land. We're in chapter 8 now. And Noah built an altar unto the Lord and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl. And he offered burnt offerings on the altar. Wow. So the first reason he took 7 is because 1 pair is going to be used from every clean animal as a sacrifice unto God. But Alan, that leaves 6 pair, and you only had 1 pair of the unclean. Here's the second reason. Because each son is going to get 2 pairs of each clean animal to start his own herd. That's right. Each son's going to get 2 pair of cattle, 2 pair of sheep, 2 pair of lambs, goats, going on through. Now here's what's interesting, because this gives us the character of God. Remember, God gives seed to the sower. God's not just going to have these animals come and repopulate, but these are the domesticated clean animals. And so right now, he's going to have enough when they come off that each son, Shem, Ham, Japheth, will have 2 pair of each of the clean animals, because God's character is such that he gives seed to the sower. You see, we get to thinking when God wants us to give money to him through tithes and offering, that's my money, I worked for it. And you know what God says? That's wrong. You need to understand. I give seed to the sower. What does he mean by giving seed to the sower? He means that the seed that you're using to bring in your fruit, to bring in your crop, to harvest, that seed didn't come from you. That seed came from God. And God gives us the seed to sow. Now, some of us get to thinking that, I created all of this. I went to school. I did this. I went into this career, and I make this money. It's mine. And you know what God says? I gave you the intelligence you have. I gave you the gifts that you have, the talents you have, the abilities you have. I gave you the seed to sow into that education, into that experience, into that career, to get that fruit. Remember, I give seed to the sower. And what's great about this is not just the responsibility we have because he gives seed to the sower, but it shows the character of God, that he wants us to have a multitude of blessings. He wants us to have this huge harvest. So you know what God does? He says, I'm going to give you seed. So when they get off of the ark, these animals don't just go scurrying off. Most of them do, but not the clean animals. No, they're there. Here's offered up to God because, God, they came from you. And each one of the sons goes and says, 2 pairs. God gives seed to the sower. God, you are so good. We're starting fresh, but you've given us more than enough to be able to live by it. Now, I want you to remember, after the flood, man became meat eaters. Before the flood, man was, they were vegetarians. Look at Genesis chapter 1, verses 29 through 30. Then God said, look, I have given you every seed-bearing plant throughout the earth and all the fruit trees for your food. And I have given every green plant as food for all the wild animals, the birds in the sky and the small animals that scurry along the ground, everything that has life. And that's what happened. Do you realize that before the flood, man was a vegetarian? Even the animals, your lions, your tigers, your leopards, they didn't eat meat. But after the flood, that all changed. Now, my opinion is, for the animal kingdom, it changed. It changed after the fall. But when they went supernaturally upon the ark, they went back to that state, of course, until they came out. But man remained a vegetarian until Genesis chapter 9, verses 2 through 4. Notice what happens. This is what God says. All the animals of the earth, all the birds of the sky, all the small animals that scurry along the ground, and all the fish in the sea will look on you with fear and terror. I have placed them in your power, under your dominion. I have given them to you for food, just as I have given you grain and vegetables. But you must never eat any meat that still has the lifeblood in it. So I want you to understand. Before the flood, those who obeyed God were vegetarians. They didn't eat meat. But after the flood, because God is changing the whole structure of the world, the environment in which man lives in, now he comes in and says, you're going to need another source of protein. And because of that, he says, I have given you all of these animals for food. So now man is going to raise certain animals for food, and that's why more than 1 pair of clean animals was taken on the ark. Number 1, sacrifice, and number 2, to allow each son to build a herd.